New South Wales Parliament rushed through new protest restriction laws in an emergency sitting in December 2025. The laws gave police all of these extra powers, expanded powers to restrict protests as a result of the Bondi attacks. And today, the Court of Appeal has taken down these new laws, saying that they're unconstitutional because it burdened our implied freedom of political communication. So let's break it all down, what this case actually means for protests in Australia and for the right to free speech. So there are a lot of questions that come out of this decision. What happens to everyone who got arrested or charged while these laws were in place, now that they've been declared invalid by the Court of Appeal? Do the charges automatically get dropped? Do the actions of police mean that they're now exposed for potential liability? What about the New South Wales government themselves? All of that is what we're going to be unpacking today, looking at the judgment Jarrett versus the state of New South Wales. Okay, so for context, these laws came about as a result of the Bondi shootings that occurred on the 14th of December 2025. 15 people were killed and many more were injured. So within days, the New South Wales government felt like they needed to do something about it, and they passed the Terrorism and Other Legislation Amendment Act of 2025. The Police Commissioner had what was called a Public Assembly Restriction Declaration, or a PARD. So if a PARD was in place, it restricted the authorization of public assemblies across any designated area. Now, this contrasted with a long-lasting system with making protests authorized or more legal, which is through the Form 1 process. And that is, when you submit a Form 1, you then notify the police as to what's going on with your protest, and all of those details get assessed by the police. And if that gets approved, then you get all of these statutory powers that are going to protect you from things that police could normally charge you with. Now, to be clear, and I just need to clarify, if a Form 1 doesn't get approved, it does not mean that a protest then becomes illegal. It just means that you're not given those statutory powers that the Form 1 can give you. And those powers are useful in a protest because it can stop police from asking protesters to move on. Those move on directions can't be given if the protest has been authorized under a Form 1. But what this law did was, when that PARD was in force, that authorization pathway was basically shut off for all public assemblies within that declared area. And so the practical effect of this would be to restrict protests whenever there was a declaration that a PARD would be put in place. And so that actually was put in place for 2 months in the city of Sydney. So for nearly 2 months, these protests were put into a very grey legal territory, which made it dangerous for protesters. And really the purpose of this was to restrict protests, to restrict people from gathering in large public assemblies, because the government thought that it wasn't the right time for people to be doing that. Now, Australia doesn't have a US-style Bill of Rights, but we do have an implied freedom of political communication. And that implied freedom prevents governments from unjustifiably putting some kind of burden or restrictions on people communicating their political beliefs. And the New South Wales government understood what they were doing, and they actually said that they knew that it was going to restrict political expression during that period. But because of the circumstances around it, they justified it to themselves, and they said that was the reason for passing this law, because it was such unique circumstances post the Bondi attacks. But after reviewing the judgment, the part that I found really interesting is why the court found these laws to be unconstitutional. The court understood the reasons as to why the government made these decisions, because it was within the context of the Bondi attacks, but they said it still was not a strong enough reason to go against the Constitution. It wasn't a legitimate purpose to suppress or discourage public assemblies as a result of these attacks, because if we live in a democracy, then we have to get used to these uncomfortable conversations, and we have to get used to people protesting or having different views, regardless as to what the circumstances are in the country. And it was clear in saying the protests itself aren't a problem in and of itself. And if you restrict the protests, then all of your problems aren't going to go away. And if the protest did continue, then it's also not going to have an effect on the problems. They were very clear in saying that having protests isn't going to suddenly exacerbate your problems, and we can't just restrict protests because we think that there is some kind of link to these problems. Now, one complication here was, by the time the court heard the case, which was in February, the PARD had already expired. And by the time the judgment actually came out, which is in April, the PARD session was actually over. So So there was an argument as to what the purpose of all of this is, but the court was very concerned that these PARD powers could be used further down the line and that there was a real chance of the same parties being affected by these laws again. So it felt like it needed to step in and do something about it. Now let's talk about the actual consequences of the judgment. What's going to happen to all of the protesters that were arrested? What's going to happen to the police who are now prosecuting actively protesters, chasing them down, going to their houses, breaking into their houses in order to arrest these people? What's going to happen to all of those charges? Do police still have a case in relation to that? There's also a question of all of the complaints about police brutality, about assault, about battery charges that would have occurred, but the police were protected by the PARD powers that were put into place. If those PARD powers are now invalid, then are there potential civil claims against the police in relation to that? And I would be saying that there's a very, very strong argument and a very good chance that this ruling opens the door for protesters to have their charges completely thrown out or withdrawn by the police, particularly when the offense was tied to the protest, which was being treated as unlawful, but it could have been lawful if those laws weren't implemented in the first place. Interestingly, the Premier of New South Wales, Christopher Minns, still thinks he's done nothing wrong, even though the court said that his laws were invalid, and he thinks that it was a necessary thing to do at the time. He's not conceding that he's at fault or that their government had done anything wrong. Of course, the Liberal government is pointing the finger, saying that the laws were rushed and they stuffed up here. So what does this mean for the future of protests in New South Wales? It really just means that police, they still have the same powers as before. They're able to authorize protests with a Form 1, meaning that a protest is then protected by the statutory powers. It just means that they can't implement these PARD restrictions anymore. Of course, the protest organizers are extremely happy with the outcome of this. They're saying that this was a win for democracy, where people are allowed to disagree loudly with government decisions or with what's happening in wider society. By stifling people's voices, you're actually stifling their freedom of speech and limiting what's happening in a functioning democracy. Let me know what your thoughts. Do you think the court got it right? Did they strike the right balance after a major incident like the Bondi attacks? Did you think that this is a win for the democratic movement in Australia? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.